Welcome to another episode of Inflections. I am your co-host, Brian Berletic. Joining me, as always, is Angelo Giuliano. Welcome, Angelo.
Hi, Brian.
How are you?
Always a pleasure. Always a pleasure.
This week, we're going to talk about how Hong Kong and China is continuing this process of uprooting U.S. meddling. They ended the protests, they cleared out their political system of compromised politicians, and now they're working over the you could call it media, but it really was just US-backed propaganda. We're going to talk all about that in the second half of the show. We got some headlines, and some of them are related. It's all kind of related. First, let's talk about the U.S. government seizing all of these websites of Iranian media, including Press TV, which was their international English language media, and they have completely shut these down. So I want to show first. This is what happens if you go to presstv.com. It's gone. But if you want to still access Press TV, just go to presstv.ir, and this is a domain hosted in Iran. It's beyond the reach of U.S. censorship. Angelo, we're going to talk about Apple Daily, this propaganda network in Hong Kong, and how the U.S. government is complaining about this. But here is the U.S. government shutting down other media organizations it doesn't like. So what do you think about this very blatant hypocrisy?
Well, there's a little difference here. What they used to do, they used to shut us down, shut those media under the social media, Facebook, Instagram, and so on. Here, it's a seizure. They took the name, the whole website. So it's about erasing everything that Press TV has done. And well, what is Press TV? I think it's one of the most balanced, most interesting channel. Yourself and myself, we had the privilege to contribute to this channel. So here, it seems like the empire is getting extremely, it's getting very extreme in a sense that they're getting scared. They're getting scared. They don't want the information to be spread. So they started. I think it's been gradual. I think the first sign started with Alex Jones. Remember, they shut him down, and then there was Trump, and then they're going to some mainstream. Like even the mainstream that tend once in a while they say something that doesn't please the empire. They try to shut them down too. I think we're going towards a police state system where we won't be able to say what the truth, and this is why your channel, my channel, don't get much exposure. The algorithm is, I saw your channel, the amount of followers is just staying put. It's not moving anymore, while other channels, if you had to be posting videos anti-China, it would be booming. It would be just booming because this is what the algorithm wants. So it's a very, very sad trend. And I think it's full of hypocrisy because every time they are claiming they fight for freedom of speech and they're shutting us down. Where's the freedom of speech? It's ridiculous.
Exactly. I was just going to say that too about the algorithm, because I was reading some mainstream articles about Global Research, which is an alternative media website that has helped share my work over many years. And this mainstream media article was bragging about how Google has changed their algorithm and has slashed their readership, because when you do a Google search, they will bury any article from Global Research or from other alternative media websites or state media from outside the US. And the reason they're doing this is because they're losing. And you're very right that it's dangerous and it makes life very difficult for us. But what's happening is we're finding ways around this. Iranian, Chinese, Russian state media will find ways around this. And once they do, these same tricks won't work anymore. So they're exposing their weakness, and at the same time, they're demonstrating the necessity for nations to protect themselves from U.S. censorship, from U.S. tech giants. And once that game is exposed, it's just like with U.S. interventionism and U.S. regime change. Once people are familiar with these tricks and they find a way to defend against them, they won't work anymore. So this right here is definitely a setback for press TV, undoubtedly. But I think they will prevail. I think they're going to continue going. And like I said, if you want to read press TV, or they have their live video up here, go to presstv.ir. And the only way the U.S. can get this one is if they invade Iran and shut it down from inside Iran. Any other thoughts on that, Angelo, before we move to the next story?
No, just very sad. Just very sad. Very upset. I think again, it's getting difficult for us to touch the crowd we would like to touch. People that watch our videos are people that are already convinced. They already know what is happening. We need to touch the people that are watching the mainstream, and it's impossible to get our message out. It's getting very difficult. Sadly.
That is a very good point. Yeah, and we have to think about ways of doing that. And so while the U.S. is shutting things down, China is opening things up. This is from South China Morning Post. The article that you sent me was from CGTN, and it was a very positive article. Look at how the headline here: China's new bullet trains in Tibet run close to disputed Indian border. And then it's less than 16 kilometers from the de facto frontier, but it's not even this is not even an issue. So they were just digging for any negative thing that they could say about this. But in reality, this is a very good development. Tibet is a very far-flung region of China, and China has been working very hard to connect these very, very rural areas, and they're doing it through these massive infrastructure projects. And I was watching footage of this train and the terrain that it was passing through, and the massive engineering project that this was. It's really, really quite an accomplishment, and this is going to benefit the people in Tibet so much, because now they have another way of connecting with the rest of China, which is a very prosperous country right now. Angelo, you're the one who shared this story with me. What is your take on this?
I think it's amazing. I used to go the first time in Tibet 25 years ago. There was a road called the Golmud to Lhasa road. We used to do it in buses, and so it was around 500 kilometers. I think 1,000 kilometers, but we do the 1,000 kilometers in 38 hours. Nowadays the fast train, so it's maybe in 3-4 hours. It's extremely fast. So it's very funny how they can turn positive things about China into something negative. I heard the commentator saying one thing, is that you could compare this to a man walking an old woman through the street, and so if China was the man taking this old woman, they would even still find ways to demonize him, saying, well, you know what, he's taking this old lady to cross the street, but because he wants to steal or he wants to rape her or whatever, And it's funny. This should be celebrated. What they're doing here, they're bringing the road. I mean, it's especially for Tibet. It's so isolated from the world. Connection, road, infrastructure is going to make Tibet prosperous, and this is what the West doesn't want, because once you see the changes over the years, 20 years of changes in Tibet, you'll be astonished. Mortality, life expectancy, literacy. I mean, name it. Just prosperity. Chinese, Han Chinese, they brought prosperity to Tibet, and that's a fact. And it's an inconvenient truth for the West.
Absolutely. And I wanted to, let's go back to the screen here. I wanted to show people, while China is investing in infrastructure to connect Tibet to the rest of China, to share the prosperity across the entire country. And again, this was no small feat. This project was very difficult. It was not something that they just threw together overnight. Meanwhile, what is the U.S. doing? The U.S. pretends to be a friend of Tibet. But this is what they're doing. This is the National Endowment for Democracy. It's the U.S. government funding arm for, they say, freedom around the world. I would say sedition around the world. And I just picked, the first one that I saw was this Tibet Action Institute. And this is who they're funding. This is their agenda in Tibet. This is what we do. And all they talk about is China out of Tibet now. And if you look at these pictures, you see end China's occupation of Tibet. Tibet is internationally recognized as part of China. Even the U.S. officially recognizes that. It's under international law, and yet they're funding this separatist organization, actually many separatist organizations in Tibet, contrary to international law. And I asked you before the show, Angelo, and I'm going to ask you again, who would the people of Tibet turn to build a high-speed rail or to do anything about that long, long bus trip to reach Tibet? If they were an independent country, if they got their way, if these U.S.-funded separatists got their way, who would they turn to? Would the U.S. be able to build a project like this for Tibet? And I would say no. What do you think, Angelo?
Well, Brian, the problem here is that most people, they watch 7 Years in Tibet, Brad Pitt, and they think they know about Tibet. They need to know what Tibet was before, after the Civil War, the Chinese, they just came back to Tibet and they took over, but Tibet has always been part of China. But Tibet, under the Dalai Lama, every single citizen was a slave. There was no democracy. Women, they were second category. There was you had to give up. Every family had to give up one son to become a monk. But we really talking about the least slave system in the world, and that was Tibet. I read the autobiography of the Dalai Lama, and he feels ashamed about this. He said, well, you know what? We're going to change things. Oh, you know what? But that's not true. That's not true. I think he was comfortable. He had 6,900 people, serfs, like slaves under his jurisdictions, under his control. And that's the problem. Those books, written by experts in Tibet, Tibetologists, they were never released in the West because it's very inconvenient. If people knew what Tibet was before 1949, they would feel ashamed to support Tibet. Tibet sedition groups, and the Dalai Lama. Dalai Lama is just very hypocrite.
Okay, I'm searching around for this. Let's see if I've got it here. Where the CIA basically they admit that they were backing the Dalai Lama, and he was a U.S.-backed separatist. Had nothing to do with religion. This was the U.S. even way back. I think it was in the 1950s, where they were arming them, and this was all part of the U.S. openly trying to maintain primacy over Asia, prevent China from rising. And this stretches back decades and decades. And here he is, by the way. This is a picture of him in Washington, D.C., at the National Endowment for Democracy. So you were just saying about how Hollywood portrays him as this mystical, spiritual leader, and when in reality, he is just a tool of Washington and modern-day imperialism. And so I think that's a very important point to make. And I think it's important to talk about how China is building infrastructure that is going to benefit everybody. And the U.S. is encouraging them to pursue this separatism, which has no future. There's no future to this. If they succeed, Tibet will be ruined. If they continue on like this, they will always be a source of instability in the region, and they will impede development in Tibet. And that's it. And that's what the U.S., that's what their goal is actually, not just in Tibet, in Xinjiang, in Hong Kong, in Taiwan. This is what we talk about pretty much every week. And one more before we get to the main story here. This from Sky News out of the UK. Yeah, and I see you smiling, Angelo. This is so ridiculous. Very, very serious headline and imagery. But this news story from Sky News is an absolute joke. So it's called Paving Over the Dead. And then up here you can see how China is erasing the Uyghur people's past. And it just makes it sound like China is going in there and paving over buildings that have been there for centuries. In the first paragraph here, it says, Sky News did this, has uncovered evidence showing the extent to which Uyghur sites are being bulldozed and built over as part of China's efforts to change the autonomous region they come from. And they're like, this is a very funny way to word that, isn't it, Angelo? Because I think deep down in their heart, Sky News knows that this is just normal development, and they're lying about it. And so they worded this very carefully. And then they go over this, and they have some exile making all of these claims. They don't even live in Xinjiang. And I want to show the first example, because the first example says it all. The first example is the Grand Bazaar Tower. This is in Khotan. I think I'm saying that correct. And they show you this picture. And I asked you, Angelo, before the show, I said, when do you think this picture was taken? Because look at the quality of the image. It looks like from the 60s or the 70s. But actually, this tower and the shopping center that it's a part of was completed in 2010. And so what they did was they passed this through some sort of filter to make it look older. And I'm going to show you how dishonest they are. First, they show, the tower's gone. So this is obviously Beijing erasing the Uyghurs' identity, right? And then they show you the satellite imagery, because that makes it sound even more serious, right? They have satellite images of this erasure. But notice there's like all of these buildings that were destroyed, not just the tower. Okay, and then let's read what Sky News says about this. One of the clearest losses to the city's skyline is the Tower of the Grand Bazaar. It was not a particularly old building, only completed this century. And I think when most people read that, they assume that it was built within the last 100 years. And combined with the Photoshop that they did on that image, people will assume that like maybe it's 60, 70, 80 years old, something like that. But then they even admit, but the shopping complex has been closed off and looks abandoned, apparently ready for development. It still stands, but the high Islamic-style tower, one of the tallest in Xinjiang before its removal, has been completely demolished. And they make it sound like this building had some sort of religious or cultural significance. But I'm about to show you what this building actually really was. And this comes from Uyghurism.com. It's run by this guy called Baram Sintash, who Sky News cites in that article. Actually, let's just go to Sintash. All the way down here, a report by Baram Sintash, and for the Uyghur Human Rights Project, which right here is funded by the U.S. government through the NED. It's right there. So he's a U.S. government-funded propagandist smearing China. But look what he says about it. So he's talking about this story. Note the date, 2019. So Sky News is saying they uncovered this just this month, June 2021. But this is actually an old story. And this guy, he shows how they already removed some of the architectural features, and the tower was next. And then he talks about the tower, and he shows this rendering, because this was being designed in 2006. That shows you how recently this building was designed and then built. And you can clearly see that it's totally commercial. It's a shopping center. And he admits that it was completed in 2010. So it was completed in 2010, and then it was demolished in 2019. It wasn't even standing for 10 years. It had nothing to do with Uyghur culture or history. It was a shopping complex that was developed. Maybe it wasn't doing well business-wise, and so it was abandoned, resold, and now it's being redeveloped. This happens in cities all over the world. But look at how Sky News tries to spin it as some sort of sinister conspiracy by Beijing to erase Uyghur cultural identity. And by the way, what was the tower? Was it like some minaret broadcasting prayers or something? No, it was a 360-degree view cafe. So is this Beijing's plan to erase the Uyghur identity one 360-degree cafe at a time? I don't know. Angelo, what do you think about this story?
It's all just ridiculous. Always look at where does the information come from and what's the motives. You see, there are lots of dissidents, people living in exile. Those people, a lot of Xinjiang people, Uyghur, they went to the US and they wanted to have an exile status. How do you get exile status? You need to say, oh, you know what, something they torture me, oh, whatever. But that's the only way. And you know, this is all around the world. A lot of people need to get, in order to get the exile status, they need to lie a bit or more, you know. But you see, what is funny there is that they are not consistent in their lies. So you can see from the first interview to the 10th interview, it went from being in a vocational school to being beaten, then being raped, then, you know, and the story changes all the time. And besides that, they're getting a small salary. Some of them are getting a small salaries from those NGOs which are linked to the National Endowment for Democracy. So it's always about the motives and follow the money, you know. So there's lots of lies there, but it's very easy to debunk, you know. There's the main lie when it comes to Xinjiang, it comes from a radical called Adrian Zenz, and everything that is linked to him is linked to the National Endowment for Democracy, the US State Department. And this guy has a very limited understanding of China. You know, they wouldn't come to people like me. I mean, just, you know, people that have been living in China and know more about what is going on in China. So he has clear motives, and that's money, you know. So it's very interesting how everything is linked. You know, whenever he writes an article, you got hundreds of medias just taking his article. Well, this is the truth. And you know how the lies, the loop of the lies. It's very funny. Max Blumenthal debunked this. You know, there was a NED conference, and there was the head of the Uyghur Congress, and he was asking, why? How do you know that there's 1 million people in educational camp or concentration camp? That's what they call them. And he said, oh, well, you know, there's a BBC said it. And then the BBC, how do you know that? Oh, well, you know, the Uyghur Congress said it. You know, it's how they say the loop. The loop is, and at the end, you don't know where this figure come from. And again, you know, those camps are vocational training camps. So basically, most of the people, they don't stay during the weekend. It's like a Monday to Friday, and they learn a job. They learn a job. Some of them, they couldn't even write. You know, they learn about how to write. You know, and you know, after some time, you get a job. You know, it's a way out of poverty. So we need to differentiate. You know, like the people are the radicals, terrorists, because there was terrorism in Xinjiang, that are going to prison, and the others are de-radicalization and also vocational training centers. You know, but people don't understand that you know, in China, because it's the structures are much bigger. For example, if you work in a factory, you live in a factory. Vocational training center, you live also in the vocational training center, and during the weekend you can go out. You know, and it's so very interesting. You know, when they show those pictures of those centers, you have a barbed wire, you know, and so on. You know, so people they say, oh, you know what, it looks like a prison, you know. But what they don't understand is that they need to understand in China, if you have barbed wire, it's not for people. It's not not to have people to go out. It's for people outside not to go in. It's for protecting people in the inside. You see what I mean? But all those things, people don't understand it. You need to have lived in China to understand what is behind this. You know, and actually, it's so positive. You have most of in the UN, you have most of the Muslim countries that have praised the de-radicalization program in China. But the problem is that, you know, it's inconvenient for the West to say that, you know, because if there was oppression of Muslims in Xinjiang, the first ones that they would actually expose China and condemn China would be Muslim countries. And that's the opposite. They're praising China. That's the problem. You know, it's all this fake news and no one to debunk it. Or the few that are debunking, you know, they call us CCP agents. You know, they they have smearing campaigns against us. It's sad, it's sad. But we need to expose this, because this could be a case for war. This is what I'm afraid of. It's the same as all those lies. The lies we had in Syria, the gas, the Duma, the same as we had after 9/11 in Iraq. Anthrax, all those lies. It's the same. It's the same. You know how they say repeat the lies 1,000 times, and at the end people will believe it. And that's how it is.
Absolutely. You made a lot of good points. I think one point that you made was that what they're doing is preying on people's ignorance. They know that people reading their articles, this Sky News article, they know these people have not gone to China ever in their entire life. They don't understand what it's like there. I'm going to get into this cemetery next here before we move on. And so that's what they're doing. They're depending on their readers' ignorance to pass off these stories. And the other point that you made about repeating a lie, that's what they're doing. So Sky News pretends like this was some big investigation of theirs, that they've uncovered all of this. But we just saw that the story of that tower was being talked about back in 2019 by this same circular network that you were talking about, spreading this anti-Chinese propaganda. And people have to ask themselves, if there really is cultural genocide on such a huge scale involving over 1 million people, how come the Western media has to keep recycling the same handful of examples? If there's thousands of mosques being flattened in Xinjiang, how come they keep talking about the same 3 mosques? How come they keep talking about this Bazaar tower when, if you just look into it it literally took me 2 or 3 minutes to find the background of that. It's just shopping complex. And they were very, very, Sky News is very dishonest. They photoshopped the image to make it look vintage. And the way they worded it about this century, they meant the 21st century, from 2000 to 2021. And actually they meant this decade. That's what they meant. And they're journalists. They could have just wrote what year it was finished. But they knew that if they did, it wouldn't help bolster this fake propaganda campaign of theirs about cultural genocide. And here's a cemetery, and they're talking about how this cemetery was destroyed and turned into a parking lot, and that sounds terrible. And if you come down here, they talk about how a large construction site with the deep foundations already dug. It's going to be a residential property. Chinese state media has reported that the cemetery was moved wholesale to the outskirts of town. So they say that it's being destroyed, but at the same time, they're saying that it's being moved. Moving a cemetery and destroying a cemetery are 2 different things. And Angelo, you were talking about how, well, first of all, I want to show people on Google Earth. This is the construction site. This is the parking lot, and this all used to be the cemetery. You can see right here. If you go back, Google Earth has this little slider. If you zoom out, you can see that the cemetery, the bazaar, all of these examples of theirs are right in the middle of this city, right in the city's center. This happens in cities all around the world. Development. And if you have an old cemetery that's overcrowded, cannot be used, and it's sitting right in the middle of the city, when there's new projects that need to be built, they will move the cemetery. And I want to show people that this is London. 50,000 dead Londoners to be moved to a new graveyard in Surrey because of HS2. This was a rail project, and this is them digging up dead people and moving them to a new cemetery. This happens all over the world. And so this is Sky News, and also the BBC and CNN and many others very maliciously spinning what is just normal development in an urban center, spinning it as some sort of conspiracy by Beijing to erase people. And if they wanted to erase Uyghur identity, why didn't they just pave over the graves? Why did they take all the time and effort to move them? Angelo, any thoughts?
Well, just facts. I'm going to give you a few figures. There are over 20,000 mosques in Xinjiang. Xinjiang people, Uyghur, remember that in China there are over 50 minorities, nationalities. In fact, you need to look at China almost like as a continent. There are so many nationalities. The majority is Han Chinese. So you have the minorities that in fact have much more rights than Han Chinese because they want to protect them. This is it's if we were in the democracy, they were the minorities would be the underdogs because of the mob rule. In China, it's different. The CPC is making sure that we are protecting minorities, and we are going to give them more rights. Which are the rights they have in addition? Is that, for example, remember there was a one-child policy in China, and this lasted for a long, long time, but it never applied to minorities. Minorities were allowed to have more children. I mean, is it a way to suppress minorities? You have actually what we call positive discrimination for entry into college. So for some colleges, many colleges around China, if you are from a minority, you know what would be the SAT, in China we call it the Gaokao, this is the high school exams, the level the minority school needed to enter into universities was lower, so they had many advantages. And again, for the last 20 years, money has been pouring in those Western regions because they were very, very poor. So it's just the opposite. They are protecting, and they are making sure that they raise the whole country out of poverty. But people, it's a pity that I wish people had gone in those regions 25 years ago and come back today and realize the achievement of what China has done for those minorities. Again, it's not a rosy picture. Problems exist, like in any countries. There was maybe discrimination maybe 20 years ago, 15 years ago, because culturally you have the culture gap, and whenever xenophobia exists everywhere, so there were internal problems, but the CPC made sure they protected the minorities, and actually they are praised now. When you say Xinjiang, it's the pride of Chinese. So why would you destroy something that you are proud of? They're so proud of their own history, and so it doesn't make sense, and at the end of the day, it's about facts. If you are doing a genocide, why the Uyghur are increasing more than the Han Chinese? Well, they're making more babies, Is this a genocide? When you keep on building mosques, per capita, it's extremely high. In whole China, we're talking about 25,000-30,000 mosques. That's huge. And those are facts, you cannot deny it. They even saying that you're not allowed to have a beard in Xinjiang. I mean, just go to Xinjiang and see people having beards. It's as simple as that.
Yeah, and one other thing that we were talking about before the show was, and by the way, this article was published last year about the cemetery that they said CNN claimed was being destroyed. And this is the exact same one that Sky News pretends they just found out about this month. So it's exactly like you said, they're just repeating this lie over and over again. If there was this genocide, they would find new examples every day. And yet they're recycling stories from a year ago, 2 or 3 years ago, and each network takes a turn telling this lie. And if the general public is not paying attention, they're not going to notice that the name of the cemetery is exactly the same. They're not going to say, "Oh, I remember that satellite image because I study satellite images all the time, and this one is familiar." No, they know that the public's going to be like, "Oh, another cemetery." No, it's the same one. And this is the Global Times debunking a CNN claim about this exact same cemetery Sky News is now lying about. And they show the new cemetery that they moved the remains to. Just like you said, if this was a genocide, why would they waste their time moving all of these bodies and building a new cemetery on the outskirts of the city where there's more room for the cemetery to grow? And where the center of the city can now be developed. It's a win-win for everybody, for the families who will go visit their relatives. They have these new graves, on the outskirt. If they want to be buried near or in the same cemetery with their family in the future, they can. And the center of the city can be developed to everyone's benefit who lives in the entire city. So,
Yes, Brian,
just,
I just want to add something. I mentioned to you before we started the show. Traditionally, Uyghur people, they used to just dig themselves a hole. They would go to the cemetery. It was kind of casual cemetery. Just a random. They would just dig a hole and put the body and put the mount. Like it was made of mud. So it's not it's not the way it should be. It doesn't make any sense. So what the authorities asked was that we need to have a made of stone. So you don't if you have a erosion, if you have rains and so on, it's not it doesn't last. It doesn't last long because it's just made of mud. And besides that, as you said just before, it's right in the center. It doesn't make any sense to have a huge cemetery in the center. Economically, it's better just to remove them. Take them and displace them to another place in the outskirts. It's just normal. It happens anywhere else in the world.
absolutely. And this is an image of the new, again, last year, Global Times, Chinese state media, admittedly, but they were already debunking this last year. And who do you think is telling the truth? Global Times or Sky News? Sky News, who's lying about this, claiming that they uncovered this, when this is an old story that Global Times already spent time debunking last year. So I think it's very important that people pay attention to how badly and how repeatedly they're lied to by the Western media. And I guess that's between that and the U.S. shutting down Iranian news websites. I think that is a good lead-in to what the main topic is today. Apple Daily, this Hong Kong propaganda platform run by a multi-millionaire named Jimmy Lai. And this is the U.S. president taking time out of his day to complain about Hong Kong's Apple Daily shutting down. And he said it's a sad day for media freedom in Hong Kong. Remember, he's a sad day for media freedom while the U.S. is shutting down Iranian media websites. And they're saying this was a much-needed bastion of independent journalism in Hong Kong, and now it has ceased publishing. And I like how the Western media really tried to make it look like Beijing shut Apple Daily down, when actually the decision to shut Apple Daily down was made by Apple Daily. They decided to shut themselves down. Actually, I was going to show this at the end, but let's just show this right now. Cumulative losses of Next Digital, the parent company of Apple Daily Media, in the past 5 years exceed Hong Kong dollars 1.9 billion, and this is they're taking this from their own financial statement. So, Angelo, what is your initial take on Apple Daily shutting down and the Western media and the U.S. government's reaction to it?
So, what's the history of Apple Daily? Apple Daily is the owner is Jimmy Lai. He's a mainland Chinese that came to Hong Kong when he was 13. So he's not even a local born. Hong Kong born. He came from the mainland, and he made his money into textile. So he started for X reason, I don't know. He started partnering with the US, and he started this media venture that has been losing money for 20 years. The timing was after the handover, just during that time. So you see, this color revolution started already back then. What he did was he did price dumping. So basically, he killed all the other newspapers because it came into a price point which was so low that the other newspapers couldn't compete. So he destroyed many other competitors, and because also he had deep pockets. So he's been losing money for 20 years. So when you have a media that is losing money for so long, and it's not for the purpose of making money, that is a propaganda tool. And when also Jimmy Lai takes as his assistant, next CIA agent, his name is Mark Simons, he tells you everything. He's been actually caught of paying 50 million Hong Kong dollar, which is 6.5 million US dollar, to the oppositions. I mean, imagine how much you can do with this money and how much you can influence the politics in Hong Kong. So Jimmy Lai is probably the most influential tycoon when it comes to politics in Hong Kong, but many other tycoons are the same as Jimmy Lai. They were very afraid. You know, a lot of them were actually partnering with the British under colonial rule. You know, there's always like local families that under occupation that managed to make a lot of money. So they during when there was the handover, they negotiated with the CPC, and the CPC said, well, you know what, you are going still to be able to manage your monopolies, you know, like free rent. They were making so much money, easy, you know, no competition. You know, we tend to think that there's competition in Hong Kong. There's not. In many fields, it's those families that control everything. And those families, as we are going towards 2047, which is the real handover when now it's one country to system, you know, in 2047, there should be a complete handover of Hong Kong, reuniting with the mainland. So they are very afraid of this date because of their privileges and their monopolies. And Jimmy Lai is one of them. He's very rich and he wants to make sure, oh, you know what, it's how can I keep on making money? You know, this free lunch. And so you have other tycoons, rich tycoons like Li Kai-shek. You know, they were paying both sides, trying to, you know, pay lip service to Beijing, but at the same time financing the opposition. But they were at least smart just to, when they saw the national security law, they started hiding. I mean, they started saying, well, you know, keep low profile. While Jimmy Lai, he had been used to being alone in this playground, and he thought that nothing would happen, you know, during the national security law. No, well, you know what? National security law enacted. Well, you know what? If you are still conspiring with foreign powers, you are traitors. And you know, it's all about following the law. And Hong Kong national security law, it's not as tough as U.S. national security law. I mean, he would never go out from jail if it was in the U.S. It would be unthinkable. Imagine a media like this in the U.S. You know, being sponsored by China and promoting sedition. You know, it wouldn't happen. I don't know. Maybe you could put the image when it comes to the locusts. You know, because he was Jimmy Lai used to refer as mainlanders to them as locusts, which is extremely racist, and it's very funny. I mean, my opinion about Jimmy Lai is the profile of people that you know, when you say the slave and his master. The master here is the colonial powers, and the slave is the Hong Kong people. You know, they've been enslaved for hundreds of years. You know, they were third-grade citizens. In many areas in Hong Kong, they were not allowed to enter. You know, I mean, it was like dogs and Chinese are not allowed into this park. I mean, imagine how racist it is. So you have here this Jimmy Lai that loves his master more than the master loves himself. How can you despise your own people? You know, during the riots, you know, they would say we are not Chinese. I mean, you know, and this is why I confronted them one day and I said, well, why don't you look at yourself in the mirror? You are Chinese. You know, you cannot deny it. You know, you are Chinese. And sadly, what happens is that the work they did of indoctrination was with the kids. Why the kids? Because it's much easier. They are manipulated emotionally, not rationally. You know, because if you are rational, you read books, you learn about history, and you know the geopolitical context. You know what is happening. Who's, you know, are you Paul or not? You know, who's calling the shots here? You know, am I really fighting for my freedom? No, I mean, you know, when Hong Kong is a third in a human freedom index, you're not fighting for your freedom. You know, you should get a job. Why don't you get a job and get real? Get real. Go to China and see what is happening. Go to the mainland. Go to Shanghai, and it will be a slap in the face. And stop watching Hollywood movies.
Absolutely, and that it really is the issue with these young, very young protesters. They are like a blank slate, and their mind is filled with media. They don't know anything about the Iraq War and how the U.S. lied about that, and how much damage and destruction. And even if they are familiar with the story, they don't really understand it. They're too young to understand what that level of death and destruction actually means. They cannot wrap their mind around it. Now, I want to show people that the things that you're saying about Jimmy Lai, Apple Daily, and this opposition, this isn't you making this up or you repeating Chinese state media. This is an article from CNN. This is from 2019. It's titled, "Why Pro-Democracy Troublemaker Jimmy Lai is the Only Hong Kong Multimillionaire Standing Up to China." Just like you said, he's from the mainland. Hong Kong is part of China. Why is he standing up to, like, just the way they word that? You should already know there's something wrong with this story. And so they give his background and how he's been running Apple Daily. And then down here, they have this picture of him sitting in Washington, D.C. with then Vice President Mike Pence. And then right here, it says, CNN saying this, not China's Global Times, CNN, that Lai has ties with the United States is undeniable. Last month, he flew to Washington to discuss with U.S. Vice President Mike Pence, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, and National Security Advisor John Bolton, how fundamental Hong Kong's freedom is to U.S.'s standoff with China. And just that right there, he's using Hong Kong as leverage to help the U.S. with its confrontation with China. So right there is textbook definition treason. But he goes on. The new Cold War is actually a rivalry of competing values, Lai says, framing the current U.S.-China trade war as a standoff between democracy and authoritarianism. We in Hong Kong are fighting for the shared values of the U.S. against China. We are fighting their war in the enemy camp. So he's even saying that it's a war that he's openly sided with the U.S. against China. It couldn't be more clear-cut than that. But we can continue down here. It's a very long article, but they do have a section, a black hand for the U.S. And if we come down here, they're talking about a pro-Beijing lawmaker who believes that Washington pumps money into Hong Kong's democracy movement to provide a continuous force to destabilize China. And then CNN claims he admits he has no evidence to substantiate this, and I really don't believe that. But then Lai calls the idea of a U.S.-funded color revolution ridiculous. And then he says, if the U.S. is funding this, the evidence would be so self-evident. And for once, I agree with Jimmy Lai. The evidence is self-evident. Just go to the NED, their own website, the U.S. government's own funding arm for sedition all around the world, and they have a whole section dedicated to Hong Kong, China. And you go through here, all of these programs, rule of law, democratic ideas and values, civic education, accountability and government, these are all very sensitive issues of a nation's internal political affairs, and the U.S. is interfering in every single one of them. They admit it, and they admit that they're pouring money into groups in Hong Kong to interfere in these issues. This is the evidence, and it couldn't be more obvious. So yes, he's totally right, but he's doing what every U.S.-funded puppet does. He lies about it, he denies it, he downplays it, he backpedals when the evidence is overwhelming. At the same time, he's very proud of his connections to the U.S. So it's a very strange balancing act that people like this constantly play. And you were talking about his right-hand man, Mark Simon. Here he is. Mark Simon. His father was actually a career CIA agent. He himself spent 4 years at U.S. Naval Intelligence. And then he's working with Jimmy Lai and Apple Daily, which is very bizarre. So he's denying that this is a U.S.-backed operation. He's constantly flying to Washington, and his right-hand man is an American. He couldn't find someone in Hong Kong to do this. It's just like Aung San Suu Kyi in Myanmar, how she had British and Australian citizens as her right-hand advisors on all of the key issues of running the country. It's unreal. This is modern day imperialism in everyone's face. And there's one quote I want to show people. This is Mark Simon saying this. I have a good job. I have a great boss. So he's talking about Jimmy Lai. I have huge responsibilities, and I'm not going to let a bunch of jackass commies impose things on me. This is an American living in China saying he's not going to submit to Chinese sovereignty. It's a very familiar story to people who live abroad and witness what they call ugly Americans. He's a case study of ugly Americans. This guy who thinks he's going to run things his way in somebody else's country, and he's going to act indignant that he's being held accountable now. Angelo, your thoughts on all of this?
Well, think about what if you were China. If you were China, you had no interest into meddling to Hong Kong. You want a handover that is smooth, bring prosperity and so on. Why is the reason? So there's a one country two system in Hong Kong. And the dream of China is to have a reunification with Taiwan under the same system, one country two system. And again, in Hong Kong up to now, even now, it doesn't change much. Now there's a national security law, but it's extremely independent. He has an independent budget. Hong Kong government runs its own affairs, and China doesn't meddle unless it's related to national security and foreign meddling. So for the US, what they didn't want was that this model in Hong Kong would be successful, because if it was successful, then the Taiwanese would say, well, you see, there's no meddling, everything is going smooth and so on. So now they've built up this fear in Taiwan, and there used to be a majority to be for the reunification in Taiwan, reunification with the mainland. Now they've built up this fear. And the operation haven't stopped in the regions. They're just shifting from Hong Kong to Taiwan now. We mentioned in a previous show that there's a National Endowment for Democracy that has moved to Taiwan. It's another name, but it's just cosmetic. And now you have Apple Daily, which is extremely active in Taiwan. So Mike Simons now is running the operation of Apple Daily in Taiwan. And every single article, most of the article is either paparazzi media, what young people like, or it's anti-Chinese. It's just an extension of Falun Gong media, Epoch Time. Very low-level media, and just fear-mongering, So now what we are going to see, and what we are seeing now in Taiwan, is the Taiwan politics being hijacked. And the US is going for the DPP, the party which is promoting independence. So it's what is very worrying is that Taiwan politics are going to be hijacked, and the worst thing that could happen is that Taiwan declares independence, and then the US would be very happy because they won't have to fight. They let Chinese fight Chinese. I just want to add one more thing. Xi Jinping, there's a speech, he said, in Chinese is 中国人不打中国人, meaning that Chinese don't fight Chinese. And the translation they say, well, we are, basically they're saying the opposite. They're saying, well, if you declare independence, we are going to fight you. This, how ridiculous. China really genuinely loves Taiwan. If there's anything, they even now you can see they want to go to Taiwan and help Taiwan with the vaccines. But then you have the politics now in the DPP saying, oh, we don't want vaccines. We'd rather have people dying in Taiwan. We cannot accept your vaccines. How stupid. It's just ridiculous. This whole politics, it's just... and it's what saddens me the most is that I studied Chinese 25 years ago in Taiwan, and you'd ask people, where you're from, and Taiwanese, they would say, well, I'm Chinese, but I live in Taiwan. But they would say I'm Chinese. Now, the younger generation, they don't accept that. They don't want to face the reality. Again, it's just they rewrite books. They erase the whole history, and how can you erase that? It's just just ridiculous, you know.
And this kind of reminds me of the story we were just talking about earlier in the show about Tibet and about how China is building all this infrastructure and opening the region up to development, and how the US-backed groups, just like in Taiwan, they're going down a path that has no future. They're involved in activities that do not produce anything, do not improve real conditions in their region that will benefit their daily lives. It's all of this political, ideological, identity politics. You have lawyers, politicians, and career activists running around. These people wouldn't be able to run a little food stand, let alone an entire country. And that is the future of Taiwan if they decide to get backed by the US. The US doesn't manage its own infrastructure and its own people and its own population. What future do these people think they're going to have by doing that and aligning themselves with the US? I mean, we talked about last week the economic integration between Taiwan and the mainland, and I personally believe that it's not going to happen. Whatever they try to do in Taiwan, and whether it's a couple of years or even a couple of decades, eventually it's going to end up back reintegrated with China where it belongs. But at what cost? How difficult are they going to make it? And we see Hong Kong as like a little mini example of how things are going to go in Taiwan. And you were talking about Mark Simon and Apple Daily. I mean, this is a white guy, an American, in Taiwan, writing about China. Why do you think that people see that as even credible? Like, who's buying that? Who sees some white guy in their country trying to run it the way he wants to, and sees that as credible? Or, I mean, is there some kind of pathology amongst these people buying into this?
There are things that we cannot deny. I mean, there are, because of the separation in Hong Kong, they've been building a local culture. There's a different culture, but again, China, you can travel around China and you can see many different cultures. It's not a united culture, and that's what makes it very interesting. So what people are afraid is that their value, their way of life would change, but it wouldn't. What would it change? When China is telling Taiwan, we would like to have a reunification under one country, two system, they even say that Taiwan could even keep their own army. It's just about the way China sees the reunification. You can be still very autonomous, but it's just for face. It's just, they see a history of 4,000 years of history, and they cannot accept, because this is part of the 100 years of humiliation. Keep in mind that Taiwan was taken for 50 years by the Japanese, and it was already a humiliation for China. And then there was a civil war, and so you have the Kuomintang. They came into Taiwan, and actually, when they came into Taiwan, there was huge massacres, thousands of people dying. The locals died because they didn't want the Kuomintang to invade the whole island. But this is history that has been released only the last 10, 15 years. So again, it's just you build up this fear of, China is going to change your way of life. It's not going to be like this. That's not in the interest of China, and China actually welcomes the differences. Imagine Taiwan and especially Hong Kong, it's being used as a bridge, bridging differences, cultural differences, and also a bridge for investment too. It's been applied. Hong Kong is successful only because it's the entry door to China. If it wasn't for China, Hong Kong would be nothing, absolutely nothing. It was just a loophole, a good way just to protect your investment through Hong Kong. And Hong Kong, at the end of the day, is just servicing China. Imagine, even it's not even self-sufficient. Hong Kong doesn't produce its own electricity and doesn't have water. It doesn't have water. Water comes from, Guangdong province. And the price they're paying the water and the electricity, it's below market price. And again, one thing that people don't know, but Hong Kong is not even paying taxes to the central government. Every single province in China has to pay tax to the central government. Hong Kong doesn't. just because they're being very generous. They don't want Hong Kong sedition forces to find excuses. So, they just close an eye and say, oh, well, just let's focus on other things, and this is why you had all those problems in Hong Kong building up for 25 years, and at some point, China had to say, no, stop. And it's not even meddling. What they did with the national security law, it was supposed to be enacted because under the basic law, which is the mini constitution of Hong Kong, there's an article called Article 23, which says that the national security law should be enacted by Hong Kong government. But because they waited so long to enact it, and there was a fierce opposition, well, China took the opportunity, because it was an opportunity of the riots, just to say, well, now stop. And I personally think that was a very wise move from China. They made the situation rot to a point where they gathered the majority of Hong Kong people to back the Chinese government. They say, no, it's enough. We cannot accept people being beaten up. Those rioters burning shops, burning the metro, beating up people. This is turning to Syria, and people realize what is most important is stability, prosperity, and so on. And and this is why in Hong Kong we had a petition that was signed by 3 million people asking for the national security law to be enacted. And and me living in Hong Kong, if there was no national security law, I would have left Hong Kong, because you couldn't live like this. It's not, when you have like riots from morning till evening. And I was even scared because when I speak Mandarin with my wife, we were scared to be in the street and speak Mandarin. Can you imagine? Because they would beat people that would speak Mandarin. How racist is that? Is this a notion? Where is your sense of democracy, freedom? They say they were fighting for freedom. You know what? They curtailed my freedom. I didn't have any more freedom. I was scared to speak out. Can you imagine? And this is what we called in Hong Kong. We call that the silent majority, because in every single democracy, there are people that are not politically engaged. How many people vote? It's maybe 30 to 40%, but 60% of the people, they're not politicized. They don't care. Their priorities is different. It's bringing food on the table. It's raising kids, paying for their education, and they're not politicized, because very often it's about the same. They don't really care. So what you end up in some democracies is that the ones that are politicized are very radical, and you tend to polarize societies. So Hong Kong still now doesn't have the level of maturity to have a democracy, because it's a process. It's too young. And it was never a democracy under colonial rule. They had no rights. So now they have to learn what it means to have democracy. And having a democracy, it's not about destroying property or beating people that don't agree with you. That's not democracy. So they need to learn this process. And also, the most important, and we repeat over and over, self-determination and it's protecting sovereignty comes above everything. If you don't have that, don't talk about democracy. Does it make sense to have that people would vote in Syria when there's a war? They did vote, but the problem is that, first of all, is fighting for sovereignty, unity of the country, and then you will build up your own democracy, according to your culture and to what fits you, because there's not a single democracy that works. You need to find what works for your own people. And it will be a CPC that works well in China. In the Arab world would be more like a clan system, and you have someone that is actually a king that is making sure that minorities are protected. We need to adapt, but Western style liberal democracies, it won't work. This new world order that they want to impose us doesn't work everywhere. It's a case by case. And now we're heading towards a multipolar world. And I think it's a good thing, and it will be finally democratic, because a new world order will not be democratic. It will be imposed, and it would be very hard on lots of values. They want to destroy many values that people don't want. We need to have a multipolar world where we are respecting every single nation, and it's going to be much more democratic this way.
Absolutely, and I've always seen that this notion of Western democracy was always a smokescreen behind which they promote Western imperialism. If you look at the history of the West, it has always been imperialist, and it is imperialist right now. And when they used to talk about bringing civilization to the savages, they know they can't say that in the 21st century, so they talk about promoting democracy and freedom. And just like you said in Hong Kong, it was nothing of the sort. They were extremists. It was a battering ram that they were using to undermine and destroy sovereignty in China and in Hong Kong specifically. And Jimmy Lai was talking about how this is a battle between democracy, which we know is just a smokescreen for imperialism, and what he calls authoritarianism, which is just a country reasserting its own sovereignty over its own territory. And I think the real battle lines here are between China developing its own country, looking out for its own people, and this constant campaign of lies, the ridiculous lies we were just talking about from Sky News, all of the lies surrounding the political crisis in Hong Kong, which is now thankfully coming to an end. And it's the same process everywhere we look. You mentioned Syria, right here in Thailand, where I'm based. This is what's going on. And this is where the real battle lines are. These ridiculous lies by the West in its attempt to perpetuate modern day imperialism and multipolarism, which is just nations, the national sovereignty holding primacy over the international order. There is no international order led by the US and imposed on everyone else. It is multiple nations with their own systems working together and staying out of each other's business, which is how we as individuals want to live. Why shouldn't nations live that way? I think this is a great place to end it. We kind of went over an hour. We could probably talk forever, Angelo. Thank you very much again for joining me every week. Your insight is much appreciated. Thank you everybody for watching. If you thought it was interesting, please like and share it. And we'll see you again next week. Bye for now.